This is the Game Philosopher. Welcome to my channel where we discuss anime, manga, philosophy, gaming, politics, and whatever else might meet your fancy. So please listen to this video. How to question or answer. This is part of the modern Aristotelian episodes. This is the second one, in fact. So if you watch the first one, you'll see that it's a little different, because I was looking at the politics that time, and today I'm looking at primarily the organon. And the big problem with covering the organon in particular is that it cannot be covered well in one video, so I have to spread it out. Now I did the same, I'm going to do the same with the politics, but for this I'm spreading it out within a few different parts, probably 5, where I discover very important points of each individual book of the organon. And right now I'm starting late in the chapters, or late in the book, where Aristotle deals with how to set up your questions and answers, which will be very useful if you partake of any online or even in-person debate, or even just conversation amongst friends that's of an intellectual nature. So the most important part is the one I'm dealing with first, well, most important in my opinion. And the most important is the posing and arrangement of questions, because of the characteristics of the organon. Deals with argumentation, and we often need to learn how to ask questions in order to get a better answer. So to ask a philosophical question, the ground must be selected where the question is made to sell the position of the one being questioned. They must be arranged by the person, framed by one person, or by one and by one by the questioner. They must be actually asked. In selecting ground, the dialectician is subject to another person's argumentation, but the philosopher is not necessarily under that restriction by the fact of having to first question himself and get the axioms ready for true reason. In selecting ground and in argumentation, we are often too much into destroying the other person's arguing with precision and impartial, and without impartiality. And what happens is that we often fail because we are ending up being imprecise, because we are trying to attack whatever seems to be the most irrational way to view the other person's argument, which in logic circles is pretty much called the reductio ad absurdum. In Aristotle, he gives us a very good way around this, one that actually is friendly, one that actually assumes the best, because his suggestion is that we actually point out the flaws of our own argument. So I know that this might not seem the best, because the problem with this is that, well, if you're impartial, it doesn't mean you're attacking yourself. But, as you see, that was actually a demonstration of Aristotle talking about this, that when you actually think about the impartiality and how it's developed here, since you're attacking yourself and putting the question in framed by your own self-criticism, it throws people off, because they're always expecting that you're trying to destroy their argument and not actually into looking at what's precisely true or good. And the fact that we see this happen a lot in internet debates is very telling, because of the fact that people always assume they're right. And if you listen to this episode, this will actually help you to learn pretty much how to get your conversations up to stuff, and that you won't fear argumentation anymore. In fact, you will kind of enjoy it, because we're not talking about argumentation as in that fest of throwing insults and yelling and not even listening to other people, but we're talking about actual discourse on actual points where people learn things. They don't have any regrets from doing this type of stuff if they do it right. And Aristotle's really teaching us how to do it right. And the next point would be that the syllogism is better reasoning with the person in the conversation than with the crowd listening, because the induction is better suited for the crowd, that the crowd being less critical than the person who's answering will be less necessary to present a syllogism, because it's more likely that the answer will find greater faults within the universals presented and not follow as strongly. To form a dialectical principle or a proposition from a question, it is important that it is presented in a way that creates a yes or no type of answer, so that there can be mutual understanding instead of vagueness, which would be related to one's own position and more open to interpretation and therefore exploitable. Now, this is where a lot of people get stuff wrong. In fact, what happens a lot is you might ask a question and someone might not give you the answer you're expecting, so you get really pissed off and you accuse them of having a strongman against you, even though for a fact that you were very vague and you asked this question that's very complex right off the bat. So you might want to ask these yes or no questions to frame things up. Then when you guys agree with this and this, then you ask questions, does this fit with this? And you get more complex as you go along, and what this does is it creates a better dynamic between the questioner and the asker, or the answerer. Now, moving on to what makes a good answer. That the good answer is defined dialectically from what a good questioner is defined. That the good questioner asks questions to develop an argument and listens to the paradoxes that may be uttered by the answer, which follows because of his position. The answer then must make it sound like he is not responsible for any absurdity or paradox that arises, yet that his position is the only thing he's responsible for, and that there are only two major mistakes either that he can make. That is taking up the wrong position or not maintaining it well enough. That in every discussion we also see a series of games put forth by the one asking or being the silent on the position, and then the one who is being questioned has to follow up, or yet despite all these games, the answer must follow the rules and prove his position to be the view that can be accepted. But in order to do this, the answer must ask for different terms to be defined if the questioner hasn't already defined them. And this is very important because a lot of people assume that everyone thinks the same thing necessarily with the different definitions that are offered. Or that what happens is that the definition is not really given. And so people say, well, I believe blah blah and I believe blah blah, but since there's not a mutual agreement on the discussion, there's really no point to the whole entire question, because this person's saying this person's saying that, and they appear both to be true, but at the same time, one is saying the other is false because the question didn't have all the terms ready, or the answer didn't even want to ask for the terms. So this causes a very imprecise manner of discussion or debate. Now, the next thing that the answer must do is he needs to test the position before advancing it to make sure it's solid. And this is something that you see all the time before most political debates or even before lawyers debate. And certainly it should be the same with any type of debate, that you need to look at your position, think of any possible refutes, think of any possible fallacies, and then what you do is you just deduct the fallacies that may be discovered when you test it, and you make a stronger argument. Now, in speaking of fallacies, Aristotle gives us 5 fallacies, even though when you look at most discussion, doesn't matter if it's online or in person, people throw out many different fallacies. But with Aristotle, there are only... The first is when it appears to be brought to a conclusion and is really not a proper conclusion. That is the contentious reasoning. And people do this mistake all the time, where they just want to stop a debate before it's really finished, and not all the questions have been answered satisfactorily, in a very satisfactory way. Next one comes from the reductiones ad impossible, which is when it comes to a conclusion but not to the conclusion proposed. And this is also a confusing fallacy, but really it's dealing with how you argue rather than how the other person is arguing. That you're coming to a conclusion, but it's not the conclusion you originally proposed. This is pretty much changing the goalpost, as they'd say today, and it's actually done quite some. But at the same time, there's such a thing as changing the argument, which is not done to change the conclusion, but change the arguments themselves, the premises now, to fit this conclusion. And that one would be a really good way to get out of this changing the goalpost type thing. So if your premises are wrong, just come up with new ones. Don't change the conclusion, and thus it's a bad position in the first place, and so you don't need to put that position forward. Now, if the conclusion is reached through the false premises, that's another fallacy, and that one's self-explanatory, because the conclusion must necessarily be false if the premises themselves are false. And, well, not necessarily, because at the same time you could have a true conclusion, but your argument is false because the conclusion is true, and so it doesn't really follow, and it gets confusing from there, and so it's not really good reasoning. If the conclusion has a begging the question, that is when someone assumes the statement and question is true regardless, you also have a very big issue. And the funny thing is, when you look at the humanists, when they were arguing against the Aristotelians of the Renaissance, they kind of had a really weird thing where for whatever reason, the followers of Aristotle were assuming certain things to be true without really testing them. Then they would pretty much argue and then refine their arguments, but keep to their conclusion or the statement which they were arguing, and they assumed it to be true. And this caused a lot of problems within their reasoning. And it's kind of ironic that the critics of Aristotle actually were the ones teaching what Aristotle was saying. But at the same time, let's be honest, some of them were actually Aristotelian, like Lorenzo Valla, who actually wrote a detailed critique of the peripatetic schools. And the peripatetics are the followers of Aristotle. Now, that is it for modern Aristotelianism on the how-to guide of creating a philosophical question and answer. Hit the like button, and the subscribe button, and the bell button to make sure you don't miss any of this, because the rest of the Aristotelian series and even future series will give you a lot of really good stuff. I hope you like this video. This very important thing is that you don't want to miss the rest of the 5 parts on the organon. And I'll see you Saturday with a new episode of something. It's not going to be the modern Aristotelianism, But it's going to be something very useful and interesting to you, I hope. So see you next time.